This book is the first time I outlived a publisher.
The first time?
Buckle up.
Welcome to Once Upon Our Time, the best-selling author and her daughter revisiting the books, the business, and the family stories that shaped them both. I'm Elizabeth Wiggs, reader, daughter, slightly feral child of publishing, and living proof that you can, in fact, grow up on a steady diet of fiction.
And I'm Susan Wiggs, Elizabeth's mom, author of 60 novels, and the woman who taught her that deadlines wait for no one, not even toddlers. Because in our house, books were never just books. They were dinner conversation. They were road trips. They were the reason your mom forgot to go to bed some nights.
I was 1 year old when my mom sold her first book in 1986, and now I'm reading every single one of her books in the order in which they were published.
And we're talking about what was happening on the page, in the publishing world, and in our family.
The good,
the bad,
and the occasionally naughty, although not this book as much, but occasionally naughty.
Nothing's off limits.
So let's dig in.
Today's book is Embrace the Day, published by Paperjacks in 1988.
Before we even dive in, I think this was the only book that you published with Paperjacks, and it was your only pseudonym that you used.
That's correct. Yep. I published this book under a pseudonym.
I know where the pseudonym came from. What's interesting is the internet doesn't. There is no record anywhere on the internet of why you chose the name Susan Childress. So in a way, this is quite the scoop.
The reason I picked a pseudonym for this book is that I was so prolific when I was first getting started that I wrote 3 books in a year. And I had one publisher for the historical romances that I was writing, but Embrace the Day wasn't quite a historical romance, and it wasn't quite a family saga or a historical saga. It was sort of a law unto itself. And so the agent that I had at the time didn't think that my romance publisher would do a good job publishing it. And so he said, take a pseudonym and we'll market it to a different publisher and see if we can launch your career over there. And so I chose the name Susan Childress. That was my then mother-in-law's maiden name. So now everybody knows what my password is on all my logins.
I kind of like it because it's also, I think, a town in Texas. Isn't that right?
Yeah, Childress is a town in Texas.
And I also remember, but tell me if this is just me making this up. This was during the time, obviously, when books were not sold online, but in the store. And your name, last name, starting with a W, meant that you were often shelved along the bottom because it's done alphabetically by name. And so having a last name that started with C also put you more at eye height on the shelf. Is that true, or was that
100%? As soon as my first book came out, Texas Wildflower, in 1987, I realized that a lot of my books were going to be shelved at toe level because of my last name. So I went with the letter C for my pseudonym in case Susan Childress got popular. Unfortunately, she never took off, but it was a little more easy to locate in the bookstore. That's not so much the case now, but it used to really, really matter. And in fact, people who studied it said that you should choose a pseudonym between the letter G and the letter R or something like that in order to land at eye level in the bookstore.
Oh.
But again, that's not the issue these days.
This one you dedicated to Jay, your heroically patient husband, Charlotte Childress Wiggs, biblical scholar, Betsy Moyes of National Geographic magazine, I don't know that name, Walker Merriman of the Tobacco Institute, and Joyce Bell, Alice Borchardt, Arnett Lamb, and Barbara Smith, my literary best friends. So it's your critique group?
Yes, that's the acknowledgement page. It wasn't a dedication, but I was thanking and acknowledging people who contributed. And so I usually try to acknowledge someone who somehow contributed to helping me write the book.
That's right.
I spent a lot of time researching this book.
Yeah, I could tell. And you're right. You dedicated it to Nick and Luke List for your parents with love. I love that. But you did say Charlotte Childress Wiggs in there. So, people could have pieced it together, but Interesting. Let's dive into the book, right? By 1988, you are a person with three publishers, right? Two names.
Two publishers. It was Avon Books and now Paper Jacks.
Well, no, Zebra with Texas Wildflower, or were you just done with them?
Oh, that's right. Yes. Yes, I was done with them.
Okay. It was just a one book
Yes.
contract and then you were done. Okay. So you had two publishers and two names. And in 1988, the year that we're talking about, you put out two books. So this is Embrace the Day. And I believe it came out maybe slightly earlier, but not by much, at Paper Jacks with Susan Childress. And then Winds of Glory at Avon, which we'll talk about next time. And you were all doing this while still teaching full time and raising me. So before we even kind of dive into the book, what was that period actually like? Were you just taking any contract you could get? What was your balance like?
100%. I think when you're early on in your career and you're definitely a genre writer, the goal is to stay published. I read somewhere or heard somewhere that the determining factor of your success as a writer is usually books in print. And the way to get books in print is either to have a publisher that prints 1 million copies of one of your books or to flood the market with as many books as you can possibly pump out and just, have that many books in print. And I've seen people go both directions, but I felt like I was obviously the one who was not going to have a publisher, do 1 million copies of one of my books. And so I was just chasing the contracts. I was chasing the publication slots. I just really, really wanted this to be my full-time calling. And obviously it wasn't sustainable early on, but later on it was. Should we set the scene of what the world was like in 1988 in Houston?
Sure, yeah. 1988, Houston, there had just been a presidential election. It sounds like this was also the year that Dances with Wolves came out. So I thought it was interesting, kind of some parallel storylines between this one and that. But yeah, talk to me about what was going on in 1988 in Houston.
Okay, well, I did some kind of half-assed internet research here, and I discovered that in 1988, gas was 90 cents a gallon. A movie ticket ran you $4. And some of the movies that you might have heard of are Rain Man, which won for Best Picture, Who Framed Roger Rabbit, which was a hybrid between animation and live action, Coming to America with Eddie Murphy, Big, which I absolutely loved and still probably would love, and Die Hard and Beetlejuice. Those were the big movies that year. A paperback book cost about $4. And the number one song of the year was called Faith by George Michael, Sweet Child of Mine. And probably the one that everybody remembers now is Don't Worry, Be Happy.
Yeah. And I think this was also the Read My Lips, No New Taxes year from Bush Sr.
That's right. That's right. It seems so mild compared to today, but that was quite a scandalous promise to break for the president. But there you go.
Yeah. So it was, the end of the Reagan era. Sounds like, I don't know, was the political landscape, did it influence this book at all when you wrote it? I mean, it is about the American Revolution, so one could see how it might, but I don't know if that was really, you were also incredibly busy, and I don't know if you were really following too closely.
I would say not at all, because in that time, the evening news came on once a night at 6 o'clock, and then I guess 11 o'clock. Nobody paid attention to it. I was busy writing and raising a kid and living my life. And it really didn't. Today, it pervades everything and it pervades my writing today. But I think back then, no, I was really, really focused on telling a historical saga. And so that was probably a way to even escape the real world for me. I don't know. I was writing books that people paid $4 for. And there was, but I did have like an encounter with another writer who got paid way more than $4, and she was an inspiration to me. So we can talk about her in a bit if you want.
Yeah, who is that?
Okay, so why historical fiction? Just for listeners, when you get paid by a publisher, you get paid a book advance up front. It's like a lump sum, and it's an advance against the royalties that the book will eventually earn. And so the book advance is very important because a big advance tells the publisher we're making a big investment in this writer and we're going to work really hard to pump her book out for the public. A smaller advance, the publisher has risked a lot less. And so I was on the smaller advance end, and my goal was to get on the larger advance end. And I met a woman. I was teaching at a school called the Kincaid School in Houston. It's probably, one of the most recognizable independent schools, maybe in the country now. And so there was a woman who was touring it, I guess, to suss it out for her kids, maybe. And her name was Carleen Cohen, both spelled with a K. And she had written her debut novel called Through a Glass Darkly, and it was discovered by a super agent. Super agents are the ones who are almost, as famous as their clients when they come out with a big book. And her name was Jean Nagar. Jean Nagar discovered Jean Auel, who wrote Clan of the Cave Bear and that whole series. And so she was a big deal in New York. And she discovered this book called Through a Glass Darkly, a debut novel by Carleen Cohen. And more half-ass internet research, but I actually remember this. She got a record advance for that book, for Through a Glass Darkly. It was like a bidding war between publishers, and Random House paid $350,000 for this one book. This was a record for a new novelist at that time.
Dang.
It's still a fairly nice advance these days, but back then in the 80s, like I guess that must have been 1985 or 86, that was a record. And
what would the equivalent be today?
Probably $1 million and up. And then the great kicker is Avon then paid over $700,000 just for the paperback rights to that book. And so I was making a pittance, and I thought, well, Carleen Cohen wrote a work of historical fiction, so maybe that's where the money is. And so I wrote Embrace the Day. I made a deliberate choice to, it has a love story in it, or more than one love story, but it wasn't a romance novel per se. And so
there is no spice. I could have read this one. I was so scared of reading.
No, it was
your sex scenes, but this one was safe.
It was very tame, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But Carleen Cohen got a whopping advance. So I thought, okay, I'm going to write a historical fiction novel and I'll get a whopping advance and have more time for my life.
Well, it makes sense, right? I mean, I think we talked about with Texas Wildflower, right? How like Zebra almost treated him like magazine sales. Like there just wasn't sort of the fair or unfair. I would say unfair. There wasn't the literary prestige for the romance genre that I think there was for historical fiction. And I was looking into it that, these kind of family sagas were dominating bestseller lists. There was A Woman of Substance by Barbara Taylor Bradford. There was The Thornbirds by Colleen McCullough. There was North and South, Evergreen, Rich Man, Poor Man, and then Judith Krantz's I'll Take Manhattan. And so it seems like there was, like a part of the market that was interested in these kinds of books. So and not surprising to me, I guess, that you always strike me as the type of writer who you write what you want to write, but you make it fit what your kind of goals are for the audience to experience.
Yeah, that pretty much nails it. And that was always my goal. I wanted to be the writer that I was, but I also wanted to make it work for me in a practical sense as a, not just a creative calling, but a sustainable way to make a living. And the buying power back then of, say, a $350,000 book advance, the national median home, more internet research, the median home price back then was $127,000. And Houston at the time was at the bottom of the oil bust real estate crash. And so a house cost well below that. And so a 350K advance was like um, not just a nice down payment. It was two or three houses paid in full. And my first home that I bought in Houston, I think I paid $60,000 for it.
Dang.
So that could put it in perspective. And then my second home, I think I paid 163,000. Things were not exorbitant. They felt so at the time when you were just an underpaid school teacher and an underpaid writer.
Right.
But Carlene Cohen famously bought a home in Houston, and I thought, wow, writing can actually be more than just, a hobby or a craft or something that you love to do. It can actually be a sustainable living. And so this book was probably my attempt to follow that path, which eventually, as we go along in this series, will happen for me, but it definitely didn't happen with this book. She bought a house and I bought groceries and daycare.
Yeah. It was interesting though, when I was reading it, it was very different from the first two. Just the tone was a little bit different. And I think there were a couple times when like there was a strong relationship between women, which I hadn't really seen in your previous books. And yeah, like the romance wasn't really, it was more about the family than the romance being the central theme of the tale. The thing that was interesting to me too when I was reading it is I started, I think, but I'm curious if this resonates for you, I started to see what I think would eventually become the kind of writing that you did with Lakeshore Chronicles, where it's this interwoven, multi-generational kind of story that spans different but related, family units and individuals. At any given time, it was kind of hard to even say who the main character of the story was, which I thought it was just interesting knowing where your career was going to go. Do you feel like when you were writing it, could you tell that this was different, and was it more or less satisfying for you than the romances you've been writing?
No, I think when you're in the flow of writing a book, you don't think about, here's what my theme is. The book tells you what you're thinking about. And the things that are themes in my life, which is family and friendships and love stories, all the loves that fill a woman's life, they just unfolded before me the way the story unfolds as you write it. So it was probably the opposite. But sometimes I think I write in order to figure out what I'm thinking about or what I value. And the book tells me, I don't tell the book.
Yeah.
And that's one reason I've been able to be very prolific. I have a lot of thoughts. And also there's a really good memoir that I like to recommend to people. It's Stephen King's memoir called On Writing. And somewhere in that book, he says a writer really only writes about 3 or 4 things in his whole career. And he keeps coming back to these same themes again and again and again. And even when I think I'm going to write a family saga, I'm still going to write, there's still going to be a romance in there. When I think I'm going to write a romance novel, there's always family members who, figure into the story. And so it's hard to not be who you are when you're writing honestly, when you're writing from your heart and from your gut. It's kind of hard for me to sound like a hardcore thriller writer or something like that. And yet I could write thrilling, thriller elements, but there's always going to be these elements present probably in every book I've ever written. And I don't plan it that way. The book sort of dictates to me how it's going to unfold, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does. So when you were writing this, do you remember any? Because one thing that sticks out about this book too for me is the character work that you did. I mean, I think in this book, there are several pretty strong examples of morally gray characters, whereas I would say like before it was a lot more kind of black and white. But from, Hance, who I texted you about, I cannot believe this kid. He's such a fuck up.
Yes,
but like in the end you root for him, right? And then there's also like Rourke, who's supposed to be like this wonderful patriarch and war hero and the love of Genevieve's life, and then he like is kind of a foul racist and won't speak to his half indigenous daughter-in-law or grandchildren until they all almost die. So I don't know. I thought there were some interesting moments of, it seemed like you were willing to kill your babies in this book a little more, even from like, I'm thinking back now about like Prudence's death, right? Sorry, I should give a brief synopsis for anyone who hasn't read this book because it's obviously been out for a long time, but probably not recently read. It's different from your other books in that it's a family, right? But it starts with these two friends, girls, Genevieve and Prudence, who live in England. And Prudence is a nanny, and Genevieve works at her dad's bar or tavern, I suppose. And Prudence is having an affair with the father of the children who she nannies for. And the mom is terrible. She's awful. Long story short, she gets pregnant and winds up becoming engaged to and married to Rourke Adair as he's ready to ship off to America. And so she doesn't tell him that she's pregnant and instead lets him think that Hance, the baby who's born, is hers. But she also sadly dies during childbirth. Genevieve, through a long series of events, also manages to be on that same boat over to America. And she is married by proxy, but by the time she shows up there, her husband is dead. So she inherits the farm and all of his debt. And so, it's kind of interesting. Rourke starts raising Hance as a single dad, which feels a little modern for the 1980s. And then eventually Rourke and Genevieve get together. And then the story kind of unfolds through Genevieve, getting her farm up and going and making it solvent. She actually doesn't sell it, but partners with a family of Black Americans who have been freed and ultimately gives them the farm. And then, they have, I think, 5 children, and each of them goes through tragedy, but ultimately ends up okay, except for the one who dies. No, did only one of them die? Yeah, only one of them died. A couple of them we thought were dead. So anyway, it's this sweeping story, and I'm curious, as you were writing it, looking back on that, do any of the characters stick out for you? Do you remember kind of like really enjoying parts of the plot, or was it just kind of free flowing for you?
I always loved the discovery process of doing historical research for a book. I loved that. And the other thing I remember really liking about this book is that I had more latitude to take liberties. A guy like Rourke in a romance novel probably would have had to be more straight arrow, more unambiguous heroic qualities. And I think in historical fiction, you have the latitude to depict a character as he probably might have been, more realistically. He didn't have to be so larger than life and, Mr. Dudley Do-Right with the cleft in his chin, although I'm sure he's very good looking. But
yeah, you described him as good looking, but I would say you didn't linger as much on anyone's looks the way you did in the previous 2 books.
Yeah, that's something that the romance genre was definitely a trope that was, I wouldn't say a requirement, but it was expected that the level of attractiveness, of your main characters in a romance novel had to be extremely high, whereas in historical novels, they could be more realistic. And so this was more grounded in reality, I think. And there are parts of it that probably weren't pretty. It's been way too long since I've revisited that book. So I'm just guessing that it was probably more gritty.
Yeah.
And we don't see these books being published as prolifically as they were in the 80s. In the 80s, you could walk into a bookstore and find historical sagas everywhere. There was a really big series by an author named John Jakes. He had some historical ones. There were a lot, and they often had covers that were confusing, I guess I should say, because the very original cover, and maybe we can put these covers up in the show notes, the original cover that had the name Susan Childress on it, they're not embracing. There's a couple on the cover, but they're sort of gazing to the west and looking very stoic. And when Susan Wiggs became way more famous than Susan Childress. And so she republished the book. My then publisher republished it under the name Susan Wiggs. And it's what they call a clinch cover, where the couple are grasping each other, kind of making out on the cover. A pretty typical.
A clinch cover.
Yeah, yeah.
I like
And
that.
so it was a little tricky because the clinch cover promises a certain kind of book, and the Gazing West cover promises a different kind of book, and they're two completely different readers sometimes. And so reader confusion definitely came up. So a reader who picked it up for the bodice on the cover got this kind of war and wilderness saga, and then the literary fiction reader who probably wouldn't even pick up the clinch cover, but if they did, they would find their kind of book in there. And so that was tricky. And that was nothing to do with me. It was to do with the way publishers decided to package things. And I always found it pretty confusing. And I think readers did too. And that book, I've never looked up the reviews, but I would guess that there would be mixed reviews on that book, just because the romance readers might expect a more romantic read, and literary or historical fiction readers might expect something a little more, a little less idealized, I guess.
There were, I would say, I did look up the reviews. There's very little written about it, including because I was trying to find someone to commiserate with me about Hance, but there were actually very few reviews. But there was one person who wished it would have been made into a mini series, which I agree. I mean, it has the storyline is sprawling, which is actually, I mean, especially in today's day, because it's what, 437 pages long.
Oh my God.
I feel like in today's publishing world, 500, 600, 1,300, I'm looking at you, Brandon Sanderson, page books are the norm. And while sometimes that can be really satisfying if you want to swim around in a world that's been built, that this author has created, or with these characters that the author has created, I would say this book felt very tight. It felt like I read a whole life. Genevieve in the end was kind of like this matriarch of her family with, grandchildren running around. But it felt very tightly edited, which I don't know. Do you remember the editing process? Was this one similar?
I do not. I remember that this was a very short-lived
Right.
publisher. It was called Paper Jacks, and this brings us back to where we started. Paper Jacks is the first publisher I outlived, but not the last. So we'll get to that in a future edition. But Paper Jacks was a Canadian mass market paperback house, and it was based in Ontario. And there was a publishing empire around a guy named Jack Stoddart, and the mass market side was run by his daughter, whose name was also Susan. And they created this imprint called Paper Jacks. And there are only two other writers that I remember from that time. One was Jeffrey Deaver. He's a really big thriller writer now. Maybe he's retired now, but he was at the time. And Marcia Canham. But they had a very short life of publishing and came out with some interesting either reprints of hardcovers or paperback originals. And so Embrace the Day just happened to fall within their purview. And my agent knew, a good literary agent goes and schmoozes and learns who publishes what and who's interested in what. And so he placed this book with them. And I thought it was a good match, except that the material probably would have been better in hardcover first.
Yeah.
Just because it would give the book a longer shelf life, which it needs if it's not an obvious genre book. But I didn't know these things back then. I was just, hoping for a bigger advance each time. And I don't remember what they paid me in the advance. I'm sure it was quite modest, but it got me up along the road to, the publishing career that I was after. And so I can't argue with that.
Now, Paper Jacks was going to close fold around 1990, right? So this was like the last couple years of its existence. Could you tell when you were working with them that they were kind of on their last legs? Were there any signs, or was it more a quick burn at the end?
I could not. You have to remember back then you couldn't just look something up on the internet.
Right.
You had to really do a deep dive or trust that your literary agent was doing it on your behalf. And so it was not nearly as transparent. Now you can see just online what's going on in publishing just with the click of a mouse. And back then, not so much. As far as I knew, I was on the reader end of it. I could see that they were publishing books and they were paying their bills and they were paying their authors. And so I think that's where my focus was. And I wasn't really sophisticated enough, or actually I didn't have enough free time to pursue like a deep dive into the, financial health of a publisher. And back then, like Random House, I think wasn't even public yet.
Oh, wow.
It wasn't publicly held. I think it was the Nyehouse family or something. So some publishers didn't have to be public about their finances and things like that. So that's something that you get into when the stakes get higher.
Right.
They always felt really high for me though, because I really, really saw this as my career and my calling. And I really wanted it. I was so ambitious, and people go, how did you write 3 books in a year? And it was like, I had an idea, and I had to, I was going to be like Captain Nemo. I was very focused on that. I really kind of had only a couple things in my life. You were the big one, and then writing. And I was a real good teacher, but I felt like writing was going to be my future, not teaching.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you remember at the time, like, what was the book promotion or marketing sort of, what was it? Because I know now as a writer, when a book comes out, you go on tour, you make all sorts of appearances. There's a PR angle, and yes, that's still self-funded by most authors. But at the time, was that a thing that was happening for you, or were you just putting the books out there and kind of hoping they sold?
There was almost nothing that a writer should or could do. And it was really very liberating. Now there's a whole lot of expectations around the author's presence online. But back then, you just hoped that you landed with a publisher that would properly market and advertise your books, because you sure couldn't do it. There was no platform for that. And I miss those days, because I do love the feedback from social media, but it's a big responsibility on the part of the author. And back then that wasn't a factor. And that might have been one reason that I was able to write 3 books in a year.
Oh, interesting.
Because I didn't have these other competing creative pursuits. Now we have to, create more content for online and interact much more. But back then it was all up to the publisher, which was both good and bad, because it completely took it out of your control. And if the publisher was good at it, well, then great. But if the publisher was not doing a good job, you had no recourse. You couldn't really supplement it with anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Paper Jacks, your agent found them, or I guess pitched you to them. What do you remember about them as a publisher?
It was very straightforward, and it was all by mail. And so I believe that I only spoke with my editor just a time or two. Her name was Heather Wood, Heather Wood, and no, that's not true. I forgot what my editor's name was for this book, but I mean, it's been a long time.
It's been a long time.
But I do remember it was almost all by mail. There was maybe 1 or 2 long distance phone call, because that's the other thing that you youngsters won't remember. You had to pay for a long distance phone call by the minute.
Oh, I remember I got in trouble a couple times.
Yeah, yeah. You couldn't just call and chit chat with somebody for 40 minutes if you were on a budget. And so it was a lot of Xeroxing and sending letters back and forth. When you had to proofread your galley pages, the typeset pages of the book, this big parcel came in the mail. So it was a lot more back and forth by mail. And so I just remember getting an editorial letter from her and the copy edited manuscript, and it was all by mail. And so it was an analog world back then. And there are parts of that I absolutely don't miss because it was just very labor intensive.
Very inconvenient, but so there's actually an interesting, I guess, like happy ending for the book itself, right? Paper Jacks folds, and this book, as I understand it, like I don't think there were any additional print runs or anything. Like I think it kind of just sort of fell out of existence for a bit, and then in 1993. You had won your first Rita. You were a real name. Harper Monogram brought it back and reissued it under your actual name, Susan Wiggs. So, do you remember like what was the process of getting this book reissued? What was that like? Was it done as a one-off, or because I remember a few of them came back, I think, but I don't know if this was a one-off.
They did. Well, one thing that, boy, I don't even know how it works anymore in this day and age, but it used to be that if a book went out of print, it really went out of print. It couldn't, there was no such thing as an electronic copy of a book. So if a book was out of print, the author could request that the rights revert to her, the copyright. Instead of licensing it to the publisher, it reverted back to her. And it was just you could just request it by letter. And so I did have the presence of mind to do that for my early books. And I'm glad that I did, because I was nobody when I was requesting these back. And by the time I had made a name for myself, I owned these books again, and I could do whatever, made sense for my career at the time. And at that time, it made sense for me to license these again to the publisher that was doing a really good job, making me more and more popular. And so the book was reissued under my real name, my real writing name, Susan Wiggs. And, I think it sold pretty well and, got decent feedback from readers. But again, there was a bit of confusion because it was a romance publisher trying to, shoehorn this material and make it seem more romantic. There were romantic moments in that book, but that wasn't the point of the book. Right. The point was kind of a woman's saga. And so I don't know if it was ever, fully appreciated by the right readership, but it did, get out there. It made me some money, and I can't complain about that. But yes, so advice to writers: if you can reclaim the rights to your out of print books, you might want to hold on to those, because you never know when they might be something of value.
Do you remember the reissue sort of conversation, or like, had this been something that your agent brought up, or did you bring it up? And how did you know that it was the right time?
I guess because I think it was a strategy by my agent, that this writer is getting more and more popular. And so you want to have this in her backlist. And so I didn't have any kind of cover approval. I never did love that romance cover. It just looked a little, I don't know, looked a little slutty to me. It wasn't.
I mean, they all do.
Yeah, but there's good slutty and there's bad slutty. And we can get into that in the future.
Bad slutty.
Yeah. And so this one, they kind of looked like, I don't know, they looked like they needed a bath or something.
Yeah. They've been rolling around in the muck. Well, it's hard life when you're getting a farm back on its feet. So for the first book, you didn't tell anyone that you were doing this. It was a secret for Texas Wildflower. And then Briar Rose, I figure you probably told people that you were working on it, but it came out so shortly after Texas Wildflower that probably people didn't have a chance to kind of catch up on this idea that like, oh, this is a thing that Susan is doing. She's like writing these books. So, what was the sort of, I'm imagining that maybe with this book coming out, that was when it started to feel more like an actual job and not something you just kind of did on the side. And I'm wondering, like, what kind of stuff were you hearing from your friends and family? Did you have students' parents approaching you yet? Anything like that?
Oh, I don't recall that I had a lot of crossover because I was teaching elementary school. And so it
Yeah.
wasn't something that I brought up with my students, and, their parents may or may not know that about me. I think that most of my friends and family were just so excited for me. They were a little
Yeah.
mystified. Really? You're writing books, novels? They were just a little, they found it quirky. And my parents were hugely proud of me. And so they told all their friends. And it was just, I think it was fun for my friends and family to be able to go into a library or bookstore and see a book that I had written
Yeah.
with them.
Yeah.
I think some of them ran with my picture in it.
Yeah. Not this one yet. This one still has the free books by mail catalog ad in the back.
Right. In the back of old paperbacks, all they wanted you to do was subscribe to, buy more paperbacks,
Yeah.
like a magazine, like you mentioned earlier.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I say it all the time about books, but back then it was the only form of on-demand entertainment that existed, right? So,
Totally on demand. That
yeah.
is such a great analogy. That was what you did. You read a book.
Yeah, totally. So you were in a critique group at this time. How was like, but it was a fairly new critique group. Was this the first book where you kind of like wrote it start to finish with them, or had you already been working on this at the time?
If it wasn't the first, it was one of the very early ones. We would get together. I think we got together once a week or maybe every other week, and just really read each other's material and tried to, give each other feedback, because but there was no such thing as an online community, so you didn't really have anybody but other writers to talk to. And I was lucky enough to connect with other writers because I lived in a big city. I'm not sure what people writers in small towns would do to kind of connect with other writers, but I find it really gratifying to talk shop,
Yeah.
just like anybody in any other profession.
Yeah, that makes sense. So you, in your writing career, are 3 books in now. So you've got Texas frontier, kind of Texas Ranger story. You've got medieval England, basically Sleeping Beauty sort of retelling. And now you've got this big American saga. Do you feel like this is the one where you started to see the writer you'd become? Or is that me like reading backwards?
That's a good question. I don't know. I wasn't one to chase trends, but I did listen to advice. And so maybe my literary agent or my editor might have said, there's a lot of white space here where the American Revolution took place or something like that. People, it's not overdone. So maybe you could try something. And I find myself getting interested in anything that I'm writing about. I didn't have this burning passion for the American Revolution or the Gilded Age or any particular time period. It was more that I would get interested in it by going down the rabbit holes. And mainly that happened early on. That happened at Rice University Library. I loved going there in Houston and doing my research there.
Well, apparently, because you dedicated it to the author of Walker Merriman of the Tobacco Institute. Who is that?
I must have interviewed him.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you really, the farming techniques seemed very, not that I would know how to farm tobacco, but they seemed very well researched.
It was. It was. I don't know. Doing a deep dive into research has always been one of the pleasures for me. Some writers don't care for having to do all the research. I always found it really diverting and fun. And sometimes when I would get to a place in the plot where I didn't know where I was going, I would do more research and it would direct me. So,
oh, interesting. I wonder if that's where there's this whole storyline where one of Genevieve's daughters is kidnapped by the Shawnee Indian tribe nearby, or somebody, a member of the tribe, obviously not the whole tribe. And now I'm blanking on his name, but like kidnapped and kind of like brainwashed basically to stay and kind of like be his servant. But you did a really
Stockholm syndrome.
exactly, yeah. And you did a really good job, I think, of taking a really brutal time in history and humanizing it a bit because you throughout you made it clear why this group of indigenous people might be a little bit angry about the genocide that had been being perpetrated against them.
Well, there's that. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, you kind of you showed different ways that someone might react to that. And one of it was like revenge, right? And so you kind of made it a little more human, but then even the process of going and rescuing that daughter, which was facilitated by a woman who was half indigenous, was it just felt like you had maybe like learned a little bit something about the relationships between the colonizers and the indigenous people who rightfully should have, had the land. And for 1988, I would say you wrote about it well, without, probably a lot of good examples of how to write specifically about that topic.
That storyline was absolutely based on the memoir and diary of someone that this had happened to. And so that's probably why it rang true. I know I fictionalized it, and I can't off the top of my head recall the name of the real woman that happened to, but it was based on that. And so that was kind of a kitchen sink book. I got so excited by some of the little tidbits that I found. I wanted to put them all in the book. Probably overdid it, but it was the 80s. It was the age of excess.
I didn't mind it.
Yeah.
It was, it was a little, it's epic. But like I said at the beginning, it's kind of tight in its editing, which is nice. Like, I mean, don't get me wrong. You've seen me carrying around doorstopper books that are crazy length, but it's nice to be able to kind of take in this story that spans such a broad time period and subject matter and group of people, and yet not feel like I'm spending an entire quarter reading it.
Yeah, I was pleased and surprised to see that it has been recorded into an audiobook, and a really good one. I was also startled, and I don't know why, by the narrator's accent.
Yeah.
She's very British, and it's a wonderful rendition. I haven't listened to the whole thing yet, but I have it. And so I guess that's one way of keeping the book into circulation, is that it's now an audiobook. You can get it on the Libby app at your library. You can get it from anywhere audiobooks are sold. But I found it kind of charming.
Yeah.
I haven't finished listening to it, but I found it quite charming, to the audiobook. As far as being in print, I don't know if it is or not. It's still up on my publisher's website.
I mean, I was able to find but you got to find used copies, I guess. It's out there.
No, if you go to harpercollins.com, you can search it, and I think they'll find you a copy. I'm not sure. I can't control my own inventory. But speaking of doorstopper books, what are you reading now?
Oh man, so it's a long weekend, and I have read 3 books, but I'm on my 4th.
Oh my
And
God, you're a beast.
I know, it's crazy. Well, to be fair, one of them was young adult, called The Apothecary, which was lovely. I'm trying to read stuff that I want Clara to read. No, I just picked up, and I was up super late reading last night, Yesteryear.
Oh yeah, about the Mormon wives or trad wives.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, I don't want to like this book as much as I like it, because the character is so unlikable. You're like swimming around in this deeply unlikable woman's head. But I think it says something in the back about like the performance of femininity, like how this book kind of addresses that. And I think it certainly feels on the nose in many ways. But yeah, that's what I'm reading. What are you reading?
I've been wanting to read. In fact, I think I texted you about that book because I had read something about it online, and it sounded like something up both of our alleys that we would love to hate or hate to love. And then,
well, and it's funny because the premise of it, right, is this woman who is a social media influencer, and it turns out it's all fake, of course, and she's got a million nannies and a staff and stuff, but she makes it look like she's this kind of like farmer's wife. And then she wakes up one day and it's 1850, and she actually is the trad wife that she's been portraying online.
Such a good hook. I love that premise. I love that setup.
Yeah, and I thought, because I'm a historical fiction person, like if I'm not reading fantasy or sci-fi, it's historical fiction. So I figured I'd be more intrigued by the 1850s storyline, but it kind of bounces back and forth. And I'm loving the contemporary storyline about she marries this guy who, is the fifth and sort of ne'er-do-well son of this major politician, and sort of how she's essentially like her whole life is to prop him up as this cowboy so he's not a shame and stain on his family. And just, I don't know. It's a really, I hope that the character development happens in this book, and I don't know that it will. So I might walk away from it being like, that was very engaging, and I don't like the character. So I need like a palate cleanser after, but we'll see. We'll see where it goes.
So I'm reading, I finished reading a book by Megan Church. I think that's her name. I had read one earlier this year that I really liked by her. So I'm reading one called The Girls We Sent Away, or The Girls Who Were Sent Away. And it's, again, like Wayward Girls, my book that's out now. It's about the way we treated women with unplanned pregnancies back in the day in the 50s and 60s. And it was a really kind of a hard-hitting and painful read, just to see how subservient the women were back then and how helpless they were and friendless they were in this process. So but I really love that book. And
nonfiction?
Nope, it's there is a nonfiction book called The Girls Who Went Away, and this one is The Girls We Sent Away, I think. Sorry, I don't have it in front of me. And then the other one,
we should look up both of these, because I realized we didn't say the name of the author either. So hold on one second.
Oh, Yesteryear.
Allow me. Yesteryear it's Caro Claire Burke, who it's her first novel. I think she's done like short stories. Excellent. And then it's The Girls We Sent Away.
Yes, by Megan Church.
Yeah, The Girls We Sent Away by Megan Church. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm glad. Thank you for getting the author right. I would appreciate that as an author. And the other one that I'm reading now and I'm really liking is called The Golden Boy by Patricia Finn. And it's kind of another, I guess the algorithm keeps sending me nostalgia novels. It's about a coming of age story. It's very ambitious, but kind of fun, one of those funny, heartbreaking novels about a guy who gets I think it's an anonymous letter, and it sends him and his wife back into the past to uncover a buried secret about his family. And it also, the other thing I like about it is it takes place in Ontario.
Where Paper Jacks was based.
That's right. Exactly. So I don't know. I guess I have Ontario on my mind, but he's like a Hollywood executive producer, kind of living that life, and has to go back to rural Ontario and finds himself in charge of grandchildren from his late childhood friend that he finds himself like having to help. And so far, I'm really liking it. I'm liking the author's voice, and I can recommend both of those.
Yeah, Golden Boy by
Patricia Finn.
Okay, Patricia Finn. Yeah, and I think I mentioned The Apothecary earlier by Miley Malloy. Highly recommend. It's even good. I even enjoyed it. Like I enjoyed it as an adult, but it is a young adult fiction.
And I'm hearing that that's getting redefined as new adult.
New adult?
Yep. Young adult is morphing into something called new adult. And I don't know why. Publishing likes to designate things as we're finding out in this podcast series. I have a question for listeners to this podcast. Check the show notes for the books that we're mentioning. And then one question before you go, what's the book that raised you? And tell us that.
I don't know how I would answer that.
Next week, Winds of Glory, another of the iconic Avon romances.
And I am here for it. Can't wait for that one. Thank you for listening to Once Upon Our Time. As my mom mentioned, check the show notes for links to the books we've talked about and more about us. And make sure that, if you are enjoying this, subscribe, rate, rant wherever you get your podcasts, and pass this to someone who loves books or grew up with a writer.
Recorded in Bainbridge Island, Ballard, and Bremerton in the beautiful Great Northwest.
Engineered and produced by Jeffrey Clist.
And sponsored by Northcrest Home Inspections, because every home has a story, even the ones with deadlines. Find them at northcrestwa.com.